Good evening. My name is Todd Green. I am an associate professor of religion at Luther College here in Decorah, Iowa. I'm also the interim director for the college's Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. And I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us this evening from the Luther community and from the broader public. Tonight will feature a presentation and a discussion of a new book by Dr. Robert Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute that's titled White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. This lecture this evening is sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement at Luther College. The center's purpose is to facilitate dialogue and understanding about responsible citizenship concerning the most pressing ethical issues of our time. Tonight's lecture is also a part of the Civic Sustainability Initiative, a project initiated by President Jennifer Ward of Luther College. This initiative offers the college and the Decorah community a series of forums that are designed to cultivate connections, generate conversations, and inspire actions towards realizing a more just world. The initiative includes small group discussions, book groups, forums, and lectures. Tonight's lecture is the inaugural event in the initiative. Let me now turn to some introductions for the evening. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Robert Jones. Dr. Jones is the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and is a leading scholar and commentator on religion and politics. Dr. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic Online. He's frequently featured in major national media outlets such as CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others. He also serves on the National Program Committee at the American Academy of Religion. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is the author also of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He joins us this evening to discuss his newest book, White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. After Dr. Jones offers a few opening remarks about his book, we will have a discussion on a panel. We have two student panelists and one panelist joining us from the Decorah Area Faith Coalition. Our two student panelists are Sletsi Dlamini, who is a senior from Swaziland. In addition to his academic work in environmental studies, he's a member of Luther College's Black Student Union and the International Students and Allies Association. Joining him as a student panelist is Alice Odame, who is from Ghana. Alice is studying French, economics, and international studies, and she is also a member of the Black Student Union and the International Students and Allies Association, in addition to Beta Theta Omega and the Student Senate. And rounding out the panel is Melissa Bills, who joins us as a member of the Decorah Area Faith Coalition and who's also a pastor at First Lutheran Church here in Decorah. Melissa is a graduate of St. Olaf College and Princeton Theological Seminary, and she is ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She and her family have lived in Decorah for about 7 years. Bringing voices like Melissa's and others from the community into the conversation is a key element of the Civic Sustainability Initiative, and we are delighted to welcome Pastor Melissa Bills along with Sletsi and Alice to our panel discussion for later this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Jones to offer some opening remarks about his book, White Too Long. Dr. Jones.
Wow, you'd think 9 months into the pandemic, I'd be able to turn off the mute button. I'm happy to be with all of you. We'll just offer some opening remarks, and then I'm really looking forward to the discussion with all the panelists. So, I'll just jump in and just tell you a little bit about, kind of lay out the lay of the land of the book and a little bit about myself as well. This book is a blend of memoir and social science and history. And it kind of sets out to tell the repressed and hidden story of the centuries-long entanglement of white supremacy and American Christianity, and to also bring it up to date and examine how these fault lines we're seeing even in our current moment of racial reckoning in the country are tied really to this history and to this entanglement. So if I jump right to the thesis, it's really this, as we're all watching the nation grapple with changes around demographic change, the legacy of racism and systemic injustice in the country, Christianity's role as a cornerstone of white supremacy has largely been overlooked. That is, we talk about things like racial justice and the church, what mostly people think about are African-American churches that, of course, served as hubs of organizing for the civil rights movement. But very few people tend to think about, just in kind of word association, tend to think about the role that white churches played in really standing up a massive resistance to civil rights in the 1960s and 70s in particular. But if we do both a close read of history and a close examination of contemporary public opinion data, it reveals that this is still very much with us today, and that we white Christians, and I'm going to say we because I grew up as an evangelical Baptist in the Deep South in Mississippi with roots that go back into Middle Georgia for 6 generations. So when I talk about white Christians, I'm going to say we. So we white Christians haven't really just been complacent or complicit. I think that's often the way the story goes, even when that story gets told. But I think the problem is deeper than that. And I make the case in the book that the problem is much deeper than that. And rather, as the nation's dominant cultural power, white Christians and white Christianity played the central role in constructing and sustaining a project of perpetuating and legitimizing white supremacy that has framed the entire American story. And the legacy of this unholy union still lives in the DNA of white Christianity today. And not just among white evangelical Protestants in the South, kind of my people, but also among white mainline Protestants, where ELCA and Lutherans sit, that are heavily concentrated in the Midwest, and among white Catholics in the Northeast. So not just an evangelical problem, not just a Protestant problem, and not just a Southern problem, but it's a white Christian problem that I lay out in the book. So before I jump into unpacking kind of some of the things that I found in the book as part of the research, just a little bit about kind of my motivations to writing the book. As I've already kind of tipped off, this is very, very much a personal book to me. And in my day job, you know, I as the head of PRRI, I spend, you know, week in, week out looking through social science data, public opinion data, demographic change data at the kind of this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. So some of what, you know, I found is kind of from that world. But again, this book is also very personal. And I think because of my kind of own growing up very active inside of kind of white Christian churches, it really is a story of my own journey of kind of coming to terms with this history and its presence in my life and in white Christian churches today. So, you know, the book, this was definitely not a finger wagging book of someone standing outside and throwing rocks, but really the first sentence in the book has the word I. The last sentence in the book has the word us in it. So I'm very much sort of putting myself in the story, and it is part of my own journey of really coming to terms with this entanglement between white supremacy and Christianity. I want to say just a word about white supremacy. That word is often something I think that many white Christians kind of recoil from or don't identify with. And I think that was sort of my reaction to it too, before I really started digging in and doing the research for the book. And, you know, it's what I want to say is that it really, when I use that word, I'm not really talking about, you know, folks who wear white sheets and burn crosses in people's yards or throw bricks at civil rights protesters. But I'm really talking about what Professor Eddie Glaude at Princeton has called white supremacy without all the bluster. That is something that's much more common, much more banal, and much more pervasive in our lives. And it really has been this very, to put it very basically, it has been a kind of commitment to protecting and supporting a social order that has protected and nourished the lives of whites at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and other people in the country. And that's really what I mean by this. So everything from who could get what jobs, who could live in what place, who could marry whom, you know, all of the ways that society was really structured to provide a kind of, you know, level path for whites and a bumpy road for others, and to kind of protect certain privileges and opportunities for whites, and that white Christian churches were the dominant cultural force legitimizing that ultimately as God's divine plan for human society. And how that has kind of stayed with us today, even as whites are less likely to overtly support that today. So I thought I'd start really with just a couple of things from the quantitative data, from the survey data that I found, because I think it goes right to some of the headlines that we're seeing today. And one question I'm going to focus on here, just to give you a window in, is the question of the killing of unarmed African Americans by police. And this is obviously something we've seen protests about, and across the summer, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor and others. And it has been like week after week, we've seen other stories unfolding here. And on this question, what I'm going to illustrate is just how differently white Christians see these events, even from other whites, even from whites who are not Christian. And the bottom line is this: if you ask the question, who is closer to the concerns and the experiences of African Americans, and seeing the experiences of African Americans, it's not white Christians. It's actually whites who are not Christian, whose views are much closer. So to make this concrete, on this question, white Christians of all kinds, too, this is not just white evangelicals, but white mainline Protestants, again, the home to the ELCA, United Methodists, Episcopalians, and others, and white Catholics are about 25 percentage points more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say that the killing of unarmed Black men by police are merely isolated incidents, rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. So if you look at religiously unaffiliated whites, they're much more likely to say these are part of a pattern. That's what African Americans say in the country. The same pattern is true, for example, on the Confederate flag or the Confederate monuments. Again, white Christians are about 30 percentage points more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say the Confederate flag is more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. Overwhelming majorities of African Americans say it is a symbol of racism. So again, the same pattern appears. And moreover, in the book, I use data from 2018 and 2019. But even when we did some follow-up survey this summer in June, found that these patterns persist. In other words, they haven't been fundamentally changed, even in the wake of the protests for racial justice that have erupted across the country. So in the book, I use those questions along with actually 13 other questions and built what I call a racism index, measuring attitudes toward perceptions of systemic racism in the country. So that index has 15 total questions. It covers attitudes around Confederate symbols and monuments, African-American economic mobility and perceptions about limits of that and inequality, the treatment of African-Americans in the criminal justice system, and even general perceptions of race, racism, and racial discrimination. And this pattern that I've described, that white Christians overall registering higher scores on the racism index compared to non-religious whites, stands out. So to make this concrete, I basically standardized the answers across the scale from 1 to 10, with 10 holding the most racist views and 1 holding the least racist views. And white evangelical Protestants overall on this index scored 8 out of 10. That may be not that surprising given their heavy concentration in the South, their ties to the Confederacy in the 19th century and Jim Crow laws in the 20th, et cetera. But mainline Protestants and white Catholics also registered 7 out of 10 on this index, and whites who were religiously unaffiliated scored only 4 out of 10. And even when I controlled for a bunch of other possible alternative explanations, so maybe it was about political partisanship, not about Christianity. So maybe white Christians are just more likely, for example, to be Republican. Maybe it's about education level or region of the country, or gender, having a college degree. And even when I could control for all of these factors, it turns out that they didn't make any difference. And so what it revealed was that it was actually the Christian identity that was doing the work. And the conclusion I ended up drawing from this is that there's something about white Christian identity, theology, and participating in white Christian churches and culture that has either made white Christians unable or unwilling to see the existence of systemic racism in the country when compared to whites who are not Christian. So in other words, if you take your average white person, you add Christianity, they move further away from the concerns and being able to have kind of more empathy for concerns of African Americans than closer to them. And then I also checked about attending church. And so, one objection might be, okay, well, this relationship's there, but maybe it's just among people who are Christian in name only, right? People who have no formation in the church, who haven't heard sermons or been a part of Bible studies or Sunday school lessons, etc. Even when I kind of looked at religious attendance levels, again, with all these other controls in place, it turns out that at best, church attendance made no difference. That is, the strength of the relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as white and Christian was just as strong among those who attended overall, attended more frequently than those who attended less. And in fact, if I zero in just among white evangelicals and the kind of group that I grew up in, or the denominational family I grew up in, it turns out that that attending religious services actually moved people further away and from the concerns of African Americans. In other words, they held the strength of the relationship between holding racist views and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among those who attend church more frequently than it is among those who attend church less frequently. And this relationship is really robust. Even when I flipped it around to look at to analyze the relationship in the other direction, I found that identifying with a white Christian group is independently associated with about a 10% increase in holding racist attitudes. So in other words, if you do the analysis in reverse, you still see a very significant uptick in that direction. And if you look at the relationship between identifying as religiously unaffiliated among whites, there's no relationship between holding more racist attitudes. So it's quite robust, and it really is a way of kind of seeing how embedded these views still are in Christian culture and how that's actually shaping white Americans who identify as Christian. And, you know, I'm going to say not a ton about the history piece of this because I want to make sure I leave time for us to talk. But, you know, one of the things I did is sort of then knit that current public opinion data together with the history. And I guess the big overview I would say is that I think many people think, you know, that the history of kind of entanglement with white supremacy is confined to white evangelicals. But again, what mostly the historical research reveals is that it's not just white evangelicals, but even among white mainline Protestants, for example, all of the denominations split over the issue of slavery. The ELCA split in 1863, doesn't come back into North and Southern factions over the issue of slavery, for example, or the predecessor of the ELCA does, and Lutherans don't come back together for 50 more years in the early 20th century. White Catholics didn't split themselves, but you can still see many of these practices taking place among white Catholics as well, even those who were you know, not in the South or in the Midwest or in rural areas, but were more in the Northeast, like New York. Just one example, you know, as late as the 1940s, white Catholic parishes in New York were requiring African Americans to sit in the back and receive the Eucharist last, only after whites had come, and it segregated even their own schools, so that if you were Black and Catholic in New York, you couldn't go to just any Catholic school in New York. You had to go to the one designated. St. Mark's Parish was the one designated with an African American school. And you know what I sort of, again, the history along with the public opinion data, you know, really paints this picture. And you know, on the one hand, when you talk to contemporary Christians or the church I grew up in, I think our self-image was that, you know, that slavery, segregation, and overt declarations of white supremacy were antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. I certainly would have said that growing up, but I think I was not at all conscious of all the other ways in which these beliefs and these other kind of commitments were still buried and embedded in the institutions and the theology and the liturgy. And just not that far back there, I mean, even just one generation back from me, that the real unsettling truth is that for nearly all of American history, there was a light-skinned Jesus that was conjured by most white congregations, who was not just indifferent to the status quo of racial inequality, but that Jesus, that light-skinned Jesus, actually demanded its defense and preservation, and in fact was the symbol of a naturally divinely ordered a society where whites were meant to be at the top and everyone else was meant to be under that. And that was actually God's design for society. So to kind of wrap this up, you know, I'd say this, that, you know, the country is today clearly facing a reckoning on racial justice. And the question is being called, I cannot, in my lifetime, I was born in 1968, so I missed the kind of, kind of height of the civil rights movement. But in my lifetime, I can certainly say in my adult lifetime, I've never seen a moment like this. I do think there's an opportunity for us here, and particularly for white Christian churches, to finally do the thing that we have never done, and that is to tell the truth about our history, and to do the work, I think, of disentangling this a priori commitment to the supremacy of whites and to valuing the lives of whites and advantaging the lives of whites over others, and to really repent of that past and to move ourselves into a different future. And we're seeing these monuments to white supremacy kind of falling in Richmond, Montgomery, some other places around the country. But I think the real question is whether white Christians will take the lead, not only in supporting that reformation of our civic landscape, but to dismantling the white supremacist worldviews that white Christians legitimized to erect these monuments in the first place. And I'll close with some words from James Baldwin, who was heavily influential in the book. These are words from The Fire Next Time. So I wrote this nearly 50 years ago. And I think it's really a call, and I think one of the first things that white Christians can do, and I kind of boil it down, is first tell the truth, and do that in service of loving our neighbors. And if we can do that, I think we can start ourselves finally on the path that Baldwin so eloquently put it again in The Fire Next Time. And he said this: if we can find the courage and love to tell the truth, we can end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world.
Dr. Jones, thank you for your opening reflections. I appreciate that. For those of you who are tuning in live to this event, you are most welcome to submit a question to Dr. Jones if you'd like to, using the Q&A function on Zoom. Those of us behind the scenes, we will endeavor as best as we can to get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Jones, I'd like to begin by asking a couple of questions myself. First one is this. To what extent does white Christian supremacy explain really a wide spectrum of various forms of racial and religious bigotry in American history? I mean, for example, is white Christian supremacy a helpful lens through which to understand anti-Semitism in American history, or Islamophobia in American history, or genocide towards indigenous populations?
Well, historically, it's certainly most tightly connected to, I think, genocide and violence toward Native Americans and other indigenous populations here and around the world, and also, to anti-Black racism, here in the country, connected to slavery and segregation. And these are the most kind of central, things in the American context. But it's worth noting that, this whole idea of manifest destiny, this idea of white European Christians having the rights to land and moving people, indigenous people off of land they had been on for centuries, it is very much a Christian invention. I mean, it comes from, it goes back at least to 1493, with a papal edict that really was called the Doctrine of Discovery, that just flatly declared that should European Christians come upon lands anywhere in the world where they were exploring, and come upon people who were not Christian, they could, with God's blessing, occupy those lands and declare ownership for what were seen to be Christian nations, right, in Europe. And so this was, straight, a papal edict. It was, supported by the church. This was before the Protestant Reformation, so there wasn't a Protestant Catholic divide then. But this is kind of at the deep roots of contemporary Christianity that then goes into both Protestant and Christian and Catholic, branches of Christianity. And I think I'm saying to say one more piece about is that I think became clear to me is that, every society kind of needs what I think social scientists sometimes call a legitimation structure. It's just a fancy word for saying it needs a reason that it's legitimate, right? And one of the most powerful ways of saying that something is legitimate is to link it to the divine, to link it to the actual ordering of the universe. And this is exactly the role that white Christianity played in European history and American history, of linking this idea that whites were meant to be at the top of the social, cultural, and pyramid of power, and that they were playing a quote unquote civilizing role, and that this was actually God's will for the ordering of human society across the planet, and that slavery was a piece of this thing. And you can sort of even get this kind of, paternalistic view of slavery where, it's even good for slaves because whites are converting slaves to Christianity. I mean, this is all kind of wrapped up with a very powerful view of Christianity. And I think it hits modern ears very oddly, but it's just right there, just under the surface. And it's not that far back. I mean, well into the 20th century, there were overt sermons by this, overt politicians talking about this. I mean, just to give one quick example, Ross Barnett, who was the kind of segregationist governor of Mississippi, could run in 1960 on an explicitly segregationist campaign in which he said multiple times on the stump, God was the original segregationist. And now he was also a member in good standing at the First Baptist Church in Jackson, and he was the head of the men's Sunday school program there. And when he was elected governor, there was a huge dedication service where he received a big pulpit Bible and all of that. I mean, while explicitly, and this is 1960, this is not that far back there, explicitly running on this worldview, really this white supremacist worldview.
Thank you. One more follow-up question from me. In your book, you point out a paradox. On the one hand, you note from a PRI survey that white Christians, mainline Catholic and evangelicals, score relatively high on a feeling thermometer when they are asked how warmly they feel about African Americans. Yet, as you noted in your opening remarks as well, when asked about their attitudes, for example, towards symbols of white supremacy, such as Confederate flags or statues, or other forms of systemic injustice aimed at African Americans, the feelings of white Christians cool off considerably. So what explains that paradox?
Yeah, I think this is one of the big challenges. And it's interesting, we're actually hearing this in our political debates today. We may hear that tonight in our political vice presidential debate is, that one of the challenges is that white Christians, I think, have become very good at not seeing systemic injustice really of any kind, and have become very focused on individual relationships as the solution to racism. I'm really indebted here to Michael Emerson, Christian Smith for some work that they did. Now it's been like 20 years ago, where they identified, I think one of the things that they were specifically talking about white evangelicals, but I think this has really been more diffuse across white Christians in general. What they call a kind of individualist toolkit, and that basically white Christians have internalized a kind of hyper individualistic understanding of religion and salvation, so that really what matters, right, is this interior relationship with Jesus that's emotional, it's interior, it's affective, and that really becomes the beginning and the end of religion. I mean, I can certainly say growing up, if there was anything I heard in every church service, it was a personal relationship with Jesus. All right, and that was emphasized over and over and over again. What did I hear nothing about? I heard nothing about, and this is the 1970s, 1980s. I was growing up in Jackson, Mississippi. I heard nothing about civil rights. I heard nothing about racial inequality. Even though at the time I was growing up, I experienced, for example, the first integration of our public school system. And that means, and that was in the mid 1970s, after Mississippi drug its feet for nearly 2 decades, after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. So, even as all of this was swirling around, our little white Christian church was saying absolutely nothing about it. Even as we were living through, the implementation of the Civil Rights Acts and court rulings upholding civil rights, we heard nothing about that, but lots about an individual relationship with Jesus. And, Martin Luther King in Letter from Birmingham Jail, I think, got to this very eloquently. And as you may recall, he was writing this letter not to race, kind of white supremacist extremists, people who were burning crosses and throwing bricks and all of that, or who had put him in jail. He was writing actually to the civic leaders of the kind of religious and civic leaders of Birmingham, and he was kind of dismayed that they weren't standing up and weren't seeing the righteousness and the justice behind the civil rights movement, that they were remaining silent. And he was writing with some dismay, and he has this great line. He said, "Who are these white Christians sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of their stained glass windows?" Right. And I think that sense of that is a very accurate way of describing, I think, what a lot of white Christian theology has done is has blunted, anesthetized, blinded in many ways white Christians to anything happening outside of those stained glass windows, particularly things that have to do with systemic injustice and systemic racism. So even today, we find that white Christians on a whole range of measures have a lot of difficulty or are unwilling to see things that are part of a pattern and things like Confederate monuments being part of systemic racism, or the killing of African Americans by police being part of systemic racism. So I think it's deep in the theology, and what that leaves you with is this paradox. To kind of get back around to the question, and it is that I'll take white evangelicals who are the most extreme here. On the one hand, white evangelicals score the highest of all religious groups on a question. If you just ask them how warmly they individually feel toward African Americans, they score extremely high. They also score the highest on the racism index, that is holding more racist attitudes when you ask them about systemic racism, and are just really, again, unwilling or unable to see or unable to connect those dots. Those the two things are true at the same time, and I think that's what makes this somewhat perplexing, is that among white Christians, many can hold and feel like they've got warm views toward individual African Americans and not make the connections to any of the institutional problems or institutional racism that exists today.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Just a reminder to the audience tuning in that if you have questions you'd like to submit on the Q&A function, feel free to do so, and behind the scenes we'll do our best to get to those questions, time permitting. At this point, I want to transition to our panelists and have them ask questions of their own to you, Dr. Jones. And we're going to begin with one of our student panelists, Alice Odame. Alice?
Okay. Hi, Dr. Jones. So your book seems to be geared towards educating white Christian Americans about how both they and their Christianity have created a deeply racist society. You also discuss the false innocence and woeful memory loss surrounding historic and current tragedies of anti-Black racism and how white Christian Americans should proceed after reading this book. But reading this as a Black woman, none of this is particularly new to me. And yes, there are always things I could learn from reading this book. But my question to you is what is this book's message to Black people reading it? What is my specific role as a Black woman or a Black person in dismantling the deeply rooted systemic racist structures in the country after reading this book?
Yeah, well, I'll start with, I'll kind of go back to Baldwin here. I think that Baldwin talked about his work as bearing witness to the truth, is one of the ways he talked about his own work. And one of the ways I at least see this book is my talking back to Baldwin and actually talking back to African Americans in the country, and at least being, kind of a white Christian voice saying, yeah, it's time for us to tell the truth. And I think that we're only going to get anywhere near any sort of healing, any sort of progress, and as Baldwin put it, get anywhere out of the racial nightmare that we have created, and white Christians have created in this country, if we can begin by telling the truth. So I think that most of the work really here is among white Christians to do. We are the ones who created this mess, and I think we have the primary responsibility to fix it. And so but I hope what African American. I was on a call last night that was probably 2/3 African American, 1/3 white Christians, and I hope that just hearing this may and if we can have enough of a chorus joining this, that will do some good and at least take a step toward healing and breaking the silence. I think if there's anything white Christians have been, guilty of in the current generation, it has just been utter silence about this history. And I hear you saying, I mean, that's been the reaction, I think. And I think it's telling that when I talk to African-American audiences, what I hear is some version of what you said, right? Yeah, so what's new? What's new here, right? We knew this, but here's the thing. When I talk to white audiences, there is shock and dismay. And I think closing that gap is really important, right? If we're going to get anywhere, we can't have kind of African Americans knowing the truth and seeing the truth and white Americans continuing to deny it. So I think at least one way of bridging this gap is to stand up and tell the truth. And I think that really has to be the first step. And I'm hoping that's the first step toward African Americans really taking white people seriously on this step, because I think until we're really ready to tell the whole truth, not some partial truth, not some half admission of something, but the whole truth and how deeply this goes all the way down, and our real need, how deeply our need is for repentance, how deep our need is to repair the damage and take responsibility. I think we can't get much of anywhere. So I think that's the first thing. I don't think there's a whole lot. I mean, goodness knows African Americans have done more than their fair share on all of these problems. And I think it's time for white Christian Americans, I mean, it's well past time for us to do our part. I think that's where most of the work needs to be done. So, I mean, if anything, I would just say, African Americans in this country, I think, have been, just unbelievably patient. Through just centuries of oppression and denial. And I think breaking the silence and kind of getting us to a place where we're actually having a more truthful conversation, I think hopefully can at least be the first steps toward bringing some healing. But that healing, I just want to be really clear about this, is not going to come without justice, right? And we're really going to have to make sure that we are not just talking about putting our arms around each other and let's let bygones be bygones, but we really have to talk about the work of justice in the present that's so deeply and closely connected to the past.
Thank you. I'll just pass it on to Sletsi.
Thank you. So Dr. Jones, in your book and earlier in the lecture, you mentioned that white Christianity has functioned to protect or serve the interests of those under its canopy, that is white Christians, by maintaining the status quo. And in turn, those white Christians strongly defend the purity and innocence of the religion despite the crimes and injustices that have been committed and or justified in the name of the religion. So my question is to you, as a white man yourself, what helped you recognize or realize this marriage between white supremacy and American Christianity? And instead of defending the innocence of the religion like some Christians do, what urged you to acknowledge this relationship, do some more research, explore your own past, and kind of bring it all to light in a book like you did?
No, thanks for that question. It's been a journey. I mean, I'll say, the first glimpse I really had of this, I mean, this also tells you, I think, how powerful this mythology has been, this mythology of innocence and purity, and that, white Christians are good people who do good things. I mean, this kind of mythology and a really uncritical and I would say immature, history. I didn't know anything about even my own denomination's history, really, a true story about that until I was in my 20s. I was probably like close to your age by the time I heard anything about that. And that's despite, again, I was at church like 5 times a week growing up. I mean, I was there pretty much anytime the door opened all the way through my teenage years. I went to a Baptist college, I went to a Baptist seminary. It wasn't until I was sitting in a Baptist history class in seminary that I finally had a professor who just told it straight and said, look, here's the beginning, the Genesis story of the Southern Baptist Convention was that it began in 1845 as a place where white Christian ministers who had enslaved other human beings based on the color of their skin could be ministers of the gospel in good standing. I mean, that was the purpose of the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention. It was a break between Northern and Southern Baptists, and Baptists in the South really formed their own denomination explicitly to put their blessing, put a Christian blessing on a Christian blessing on slavery. And I didn't know that story at all until, again, I was in my early 20s. And you know, so that stayed with me. And I think what really has moved me over the last 5 years, particularly, was, we may talk about this a little bit later in the Q&A too, but was the killing of 9 African Americans at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston in 2015 by a white Christian terrorist, Dylan Roof, and who did it, you know, in the name of starting a race war. But what didn't get a lot of attention in the media was that he was an ELCA Lutheran. He was a baptized Lutheran in good standing at a Lutheran church, and that he saw his Christian identity as part of his white supremacist identity. Like, these were integrated in his mind. He didn't see a conflict between being a Christian and being a white supremacist. In fact, when he was, I actually reproduce this image in the book, when he was in prison and was kind of drawing, and he was writing out his kind of white supremacist manifesto. But as he was writing this text, he was doodling in the margins, and in the margins of that journal are all these Christian symbols. There's crosses, and there's a full page picture of a white Jesus emerging from the tomb. And even in his own little personal logo, that he developed a kind of a white supremacist logo for himself. At the center of that logo was a cross. And in the quadrants created by the cross, he has 4 white supremacist symbols. I mean, that's how integrated, even visually, he saw it. So, you know, I think that really shook me. I think, you know, and just a kind of cascading set of events, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, you know, just a litany of people, particularly killed by police, African Americans killed by police. And then Charlottesville, you know, we just passed where we had white supremacists like openly marching with tiki torches, chanting neo-Nazi slogans, saying Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, and blood and soil, you know, and linking all of that to this kind of white Christian nationalism very explicitly. I mean, all of these things, I think, were things, and I think it coming more out of the woodwork and onto the surface, I think in the last 5 years has been part of, I think, what's helped kind of push me to kind of dig a little further. And I think, again, you know, just try to bear witness to the truth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I come at this as a representative of a denomination. I'm a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. It's the denomination I serve, the denomination with which Luther College is affiliated. And currently in our denomination, there is the rumblings of a grassroots movement that's calling for the ELCA's church-wide organization to commit $32 million in reparations rather than continuing to invest significant funding to maintain the institutional structure. And Stephen comes with the hashtag defund churchwide. So this raises a deep question for me about the capacity for change within primarily white institutions, especially white churches and white church institutions. Given that the history of white supremacy and the history of white Christianity in America are so intertwined and have been so mutually beneficial, do you think it's possible for an institution like the ELCA or any other white church body to do this work of anti-racism, reparation, and reform from within the existing institutional structures? Or do you think that dismantling racism within our church structures will necessitate dismantling the institutions themselves? What do you see as possibilities? Where might leaders and members of white churches put our creative energy on this?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. Thank you for that. It's really important. I will say this, that I want to make sure I cover this in the book as well, but the ELCA did acknowledge this connection to Dylan Roof in real time, you know, and put out a press release, talked about it very frankly. And I think that was really important to do because the mainstream press really wasn't talking about this at all. So I think there would have been a way that the leadership of the ELCA could have just kind of ducked its head down and it would have blown over. But I think really taking this seriously was something, was really a move of authenticity and integrity that I want to kind of give a shout out to and respect. And Yeah, and there are conversations happening. There's also conversations in the Episcopal Church happening about funds for reparations. And I do think that it's right that these things have to go together. This has always been about wealth and power, and so money is a real part of this. I mean, the reason that many white Christian institutions have the endowments that they do can be directly tied to slave labor, to exploiting Black labor in many ways. So it's not an abstract or even a dotted line kind of question. I mean, it's a straight line, kind of question. So I think these things have to go together. You certainly are not going to do any kind of work of, dismantling anti-Black racism without taking on the material side of that, right? You can't out-seminar your way out of this problem. I mean, so no numbers of seminars are going to really get to the root of it. But I think taking seriously this, and it's coming at a time when, of course, the coffers are not full, right? And many churches are struggling, and many denominations are struggling for some years of decline over the past few decades. So it's coming at a tough time, and these are hard conversations. But I think there's no way of having this conversation with any integrity without putting our money where our mouths are. That these two things have to go. And as far as I think there's one way to think about it. It's easiest to think about, well, if we commit all this money, it's going to destabilize our already kind of wobbly institutions. But I think it could play out another way. I mean, it's also possible that people could actually see an authentic witness and want to be a part of it. Right? Of somebody actually doing something that looks meaningful and looks like they mean it. There could actually be an influx of people who say, "Oh, I want to join that. Like that looks real." And I think that's not thought about, that much. But beyond the kind of gaming it out piece of it, I mean, I think there just is a question of what's right. What does it mean again to tell the truth and love our neighbor? What does it mean in this context? And I think it has to mean something material and not just token. I mean, it has to be something that I think actually is meaningful and that has some lasting effects and has a direct connection to the history.
Thank you for our panelists so far for those great questions. As we're getting to the latter part of our event here, I want to have our panelists come back in to ask a few more questions. We got a couple of questions in advance of the event. So I'm going to turn back to Alice and have her ask one of those questions. Alice?
Okay, so the next question is, what does it mean to dismantle white supremacy? What are the practices, strategies, techniques? What practices, strategies, techniques have you found useful for dismantling internalized white supremacy in your own life? What suggestions do you have for pastors to go beyond addressing white supremacy and to work to dismantle it in our congregations?
Great. Yeah. Well, I think this sometimes feels overwhelming when you hear a question like that, but I think it actually doesn't have to be. And I'll give just a couple of examples. Just a couple of personal ones, and what I've seen other churches doing. So just a personal one. Even as someone as an individual, there's work to do. And one of the practices that I did, kind of working on the book, for example, was just ask myself a question. And I should preface this by saying this is a question that only someone who has grown up thinking of themselves as white and being part of the dominant culture can really ask themselves. And it's this question, where does race show up for me in my memory? Right now, if you're not white, that's a sort of nonsensical question because it's there all the time. But if you're white and you have this sort of gift of thinking that sort of, race is kind of invisible because you've been in part of this privileged strata, that's a question worth asking. Right. And for me, honestly, when I first asked myself that question, and I just set up some time to journal a little bit and just stare at a blank page, see if I could let things come. And what I found was when I first started doing it, it was difficult and there wasn't a lot that really came to mind. But then once one thing came, another thing came, and it was sort of like a thread, you kind of pull this thread and it turns out that thread's connected to a whole lot of other things. And it kind of helped me reflect on my experience of, experiencing the first African-American kids showing up at my elementary school, growing up and going to a high school whose mascot was Colonel Rebel, like a Confederate soldier, and who flew the Confederate flag we were my high school was the Rebels, and we flew the Confederate flag and the band played Dixie when the football team scored a touchdown. I never reflected on that really, growing up. Seeing the KKK demonstrating outside of our soccer fields, as a kid, kind of late elementary, early middle school, that kind of came and went, didn't think a whole lot about it. Family stories, understanding kind of the role of my own church, and having like a restrictive policy that didn't allow African Americans to attend our services, for example, that I never knew was in place. Finding out that my grandfather was, and this is part of kind of telling the story to my family, was actually a deacon whose job it was in the early 1960s to stand on the front steps of East Macon Baptist Church and prevent African Americans from entering the sanctuary if they tried. Right, to kind of keep the sanctuary segregated. So I would say like it's narrative. I think, first of all, kind of being honest with ourselves, and being able to tell, and then finding some people to be in community and tell these stories with each other. And one other thing I think that many churches could do is if white Christian churches just ask themselves this basic question, why is our church geographically located where it is? That very quickly gets to race in most situations. If it's a very old church, there are sort of questions about, well, why is it here and what role did it play? If it's like pre-Civil War, like some churches, but even if it's more recent, if it's out in the suburbs, well, is it in an all-white suburb? And when did it get built there? And did it follow the white flight out from inner city neighborhoods out to, as whites were leaving neighborhoods as it becomes segregated? Was it part of that mission? If it has a private school attached to it, why was that private school established? Was it established to allow to be somewhere white kids could go and not have to go to school with black kids? Kind of just getting to the heart of those things. But then I think, eventually there's that kind of truth telling that has to happen inside of white Christian churches. And then I think there really has to be community building between white and black churches in particular. I talk about it, I won't go into it now, but a case study in the book of two Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, that really set out 7 years ago to build community together. And it's been utterly transformative, I think, for both churches, but particularly for the predominantly white church in that relationship, as they just built relationships that has challenged all kinds of assumptions that they've had about their own church, about their own faith. And has really, I think, put them on a different journey than they would have ever been able to be on by themselves.
Thank you for that. I think those are questions that many of us, especially in Decorah, Iowa, should be thinking about. So thank you for that. I think Sletsi will be asking the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So our next question for Dr. Jones is, can you speak to why you decided not to include a chapter or more extensive discussion in your book on the efforts of white Christians to oppose slavery and biblical justifications for slavery? Can you also address to what extent support for slavery and later Jim Crow laws was more about culture than Christianity, particularly given the efforts of some white Christians to oppose both of these?
Well, I think the main reason I didn't tell that story is because that's the favorite story white Christians like to tell. I think that when white Christians talk about slavery, they most often want to talk about the minority of whites who were on the side of abolition. They want to talk about Wilberforce. They want to talk about, there's kind of these tropes that kind of come out. But, even if you take somebody like Charles Finney, who was a Presbyterian minister, a very strong abolitionist, it doesn't take too much to realize the way that even in someone like him, who was very committed to abolishing slavery, very active, very prominent voice in New York, he wasn't in the South. But even with him, what happened, so after the war, he had a younger protege of his who was setting up, was going to organize a interracial worship service in the wake of the abolition of slavery. And even Finney stopped him and said, no, sir, you err in supposing that the cause of abolition and the cause of amalgamation are the same. And even though he was very much for abolition, he was not for what he called amalgamation, that is, of the mixing of races inside of a church setting. He still thought it proper to keep the races keep the races separate in that setting. And Frederick Douglass, I think, is really helpful here. He was utterly dismayed after the Civil War that I think he thought, and I think I had this impression too, that the abolition of slavery meant the abolition of white supremacy, right? That these two things were tied together. And I think what he was so disturbed about was that how easily white supremacy continued to live within white Christianity in particular, even after slavery was off the table as a political and economic issue. And so I guess, the answer is this. I think that the comfortable answers, sure. Was there an abolitionist movement in white Christian circles? Absolutely. Were there people who marched with Martin Luther King? Were there denominational leaders who stood up and took very courageous and costly stands on the side of civil rights, on the side of justice? Like, absolutely, there were. Were those the majority of white Christians in the country? Absolutely not. And so I think the sort of truth telling really has to reckon not with our best examples of people who were cutting against the grain and swimming against the stream. I mean, I think those are heroes, and we really ought to salute them, and we owe a great debt of gratitude for the risks that they took. But the truth of the matter is, they were all taking risks because they were so cutting against the grain and going against the stream. They were not at all the mainstream of white Christianity. And so I think the real purpose of the book is to tell the story that hasn't been told, and the story, frankly, that I think most white Christians haven't had the courage to tell.
Thank you.
One of the questions submitted, an interesting one, is having seen that these issues affect this question of white supremacy in the church really touches cross denominations, non-denominational, evangelical, mainline denominations, Catholicism. Despite that, did you notice, have you found differences kind of in your experience of white privilege and racism in churches between different denominations in the nation? Were there things to be noticed about where different groups differed there?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there is some kind of some daylight between white evangelicals, for example, and white mainline Protestants on some of these issues, but they are really more degrees of, kind of slight degrees than they are degrees of difference rather than kind of differences in kind, really is what I would say. So always the pattern is white Christian groups are over here, whites who are not Christian over here, African Americans are over here. Like, that is like the very consistent pattern in almost every question you look at. The one thing I would say about the June survey that we did this summer is that there was a little more daylight that opened up between white mainline and white Catholics on the one hand and white evangelicals on the other, on the killing of African American men by police. Now, it is still true that in all three cases, majorities still say these are isolated incidents, rather than being able to connect the dots and see them as part of a pattern. However, the white mainline and white Catholics have actually moved double digits from where they were. They were really close, about 7 and 10 said that these were merely isolated incidents. Now we're really talking mid 50s. So the protests over the summer does seem to have moved white mainline Protestants and white Catholics a bit, while white evangelicals have not moved at all. So I do think there is a difference there. Some of that is probably cultural and regional and even theological, there. But the clustering is still there, but there has been some kind of pulling apart a little bit. Even though the cluster is still there, they're a little bit further on edges of the bubble.
Dr. Jones, thank you for your responses to the questions from the panelists and the other questions submitted from the Luther and Decorah communities. I just want to take this opportunity maybe to bring things to conclusion and to offer some words of appreciation. First, appreciation to you, Dr. Jones, for serving as our speaker this evening on an incredibly timely, important topic. For those of you tuning in, Dr. Jones's book is available from most major booksellers, and again, it's called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. I also want to thank our panelists, Alice, Sletsi, and Melissa, and I want to thank President Ward and the Civic Sustainability Initiative for helping to sponsor this event, along with the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in this evening to listen to Dr. Jones and helped participate in this important conversation. We hope you found the conversation fruitful and constructive. It is a conversation that I look forward to continuing, and that we all look forward to continuing in the Luther and Decorah communities in light of this event. Thank you once again, and good night, everybody.